Thank you, Radhika. Thanks for inviting me to speak today to the entire International Manifesto Group collective. I'm going to start with this question of imperialism that I think Radhika you brought up and Victor. Just very briefly, I just wanted to give my understanding of the relationship between capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and why it matters for understanding the war on Iran and the significance of the defense of the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic today. I would want, and I've done this before when I've spoken at the Manifesto Group, but I think due to the contradictions of the capitalist law of value, it requires, as Radhika says, imperialism. But I would distinguish imperialism from colonialism. So for both, I would say both are premised upon a denial of sovereignty. If you want to think about what is colonialism, what is imperialism, it is the use of force, military and economic force, to constrain the sovereignty of states and peoples that are put on the periphery of the system in order to be able to draw surplus value, to be able to draw resources without having to account for the reproduction of those peoples and resources. So you can apply absolute power and violence to those regions. Now, colonialism, I would understand as more of a one-to-one relationship. And this is going to matter because this is how I want us to understand Israel or Zionism. It's the colonial power in this relationship. It's a settler colonial power. And in the history of the 20th century, we've seen anti-colonial resistance, but we have yet to still see anti-imperialism have its day. It is rising, and we're seeing us come to it. But colonialism, I would like people to think about more as this one-to-one relationship of a colonized fighting against a colonizer on a territorial basis to expel that. Imperialism is the systemic character of this denial of sovereignty on a global or planetary scale or a regional scale. Okay, so imperialism is the denial of sovereignty through military economic force, but it can happen through indirect means, and it is not about territorial power necessarily, but the control over the flow of capital and resources across territories. This is imperialist power. Now, both, as I was mentioning, have proceeded through the application of violence. Now, this is important because I think, Radhika, you started with this question of rationality and irrationality. So, there's an author, Enrique de Sel. He wrote this book, The Invention of the Americas. And in this book, he has this very provocative point that Western imperialism is founded actually on irrationality, because he's saying it is not built on a rational coexistence where negotiated agreements and treaties between the West and non-West can be arrived at. There's always this absolute violence that underpins all treaties and deals. From the 16th century in the Americas to what happens with China and the Opium War treaties until today. So I mentioned this because we can see this at play with Iran today. For example, you can see very clearly that this so-called deal making that they've been engaged with, they are trying to impose terms through the application of violence. They're not actually trying to negotiate in good faith. They've very openly mentioned this the last couple of days, that we were deceiving. We were engaged in deception the last 5 months. We weren't actually negotiating. And we know with the treaties in the Americas, with indigenous peoples, broken treaties and so forth, this history that Marx called the fraud, force, and deception has been pivotal to the history of imperialism. And so we can see here today that they are seeking not to negotiate in good faith with Iran. They're seeking to impose a framework by removing from Iran, by disarming Iran, and then imposing terms that will reproduce imperialist power. And I forgot to mention this, but imperialist power, it's built upon being able to maintain a monopoly on military and economic force. And that's what they're trying to restore. That's what Iran has challenged, and that's what they're trying to restore through this fraudulent treaty. Now, on what's happening specifically today, I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Radhika. We have to understand what's happening in Iran today as an extension and continuation of the genocide in Palestine. We cannot understand it any differently. Anyone who opposes the genocide in Palestine, if you hit the streets against the genocide in Palestine, you must oppose this war. Let's just look at the logic of this war. What is one of the first things we saw? Hundreds of students were massacred in Iran. Hundreds of students were massacred in a primary school. We saw volleyball players being massacred in Iran. This is, again, them applying a genocidal logic to force those who resist at the basis of imperialism, who resist the military and economic basis of imperialism, to force them into surrender. To say, if you do not surrender, we will slaughter your children and we will slaughter your unarmed population. We saw this in Palestine. This is the same war, and Iran is being targeted precisely because Iran has been the strategic depth to the axis of resistance for 46 years now. And why is this so significant? Because we must remember the Islamic Revolution happens at a particular moment in history. 1979 comes 6 years after the Yom Kippur War. It comes at a moment where the United States is flexing its power as it's approaching what it calls the end of history, so-called. Okay, so in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War ends, the United States enforces an arrangement in the region which ties the oil to the US dollar, and Israel is a fundamental force projection state that is necessary to maintain the US relationship between the US dollar and oil flows. This is necessary to stave off the crisis of US capitalism that emerges in the 1970s for the first time. The United States has a crisis of accumulation. Germany and Japan are eating into its profits, but also the rise of Southern industrialization. And what the US hits on is not to compete, as Radhika said, in productive sectors, but to turn to financial and military power to skim off the top through the US dollar, through the financial power of Wall Street that's backed by the military, that's backed by the control over oil. So that's a fundamental arrangement of US imperialism. With the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which is an explicitly anti-imperialist revolution, we can recall that it is opposed to US control over oil flows, because that's what they did to Iran in 1953 when they overthrew the Mossadegh government. And one point before I forget, we cannot forget that in the 1953 coup d'etat, the United States paid armed agitators to hit the streets in Tehran to make it seem like there's a popular movement against Mossadegh. This is an old script. So the 1979 revolution is challenging the renewal, or what Victor may call new imperialism. What we see in the 1970s, this dollar-oil relationship, is fundamentally challenged by the Islamic Revolution, which is once again asserting sovereign control over resources, but it also reintroduces the military equation. It starts to provide military strategic depth to resistance forces in the region at the moment that they're being disarmed otherwise. At the moment Egypt is being defeated, at the moment the Arab strategic depth is being undermined, at the moment the Palestinian Liberation Organization is being disarmed, the Islamic Republic renews the resistance path in the 1980s. This is why it's such a threat. We should not get confused. You can look at internal contradictions of any state, but there's one reason that Iran is targeted again and again and again, is because it emerged at a moment when imperialism thought it was victorious, and it provisioned strategic depth to resistance forces. And this is what leads, not only Hezbollah is a force in its own right in Lebanon, but this is what leads to victories against Zionism and imperialism on the military field in the 1990s and the 2000s. This is what leads the US to start sanctioning Iran in the 1990s, first under the Clinton administration, as an attempt to undermine the military power that Iran has raised to challenge US imperialism. As the Western left will often get confused here, because the United States will sanction a country on the claims of accusing it of authoritarianism. But we have to understand, when they accuse a country of authoritarianism, they mean a state that's establishing authority over transnational capital, authority over its military sovereignty. That's who they will call authoritarian, and the Western left should stop and cease with reproducing those narratives. So these sanctions hit Iran, and Iran is able to withstand the sanctions because of its tie-up with the other challenge to the end of history, the fundamental challenge that the rise of China poses to the economic basis of imperialism. So Iran is able to withstand sanctions for the past 25 years, continue be able to act as a bulwark for the axis of resistance, which leads to Hezbollah defeating Israel in 2006 and the Palestinians rising in their capacity over the past 20 years to challenge the basis of Zionist power, which again, Zionism is not a force in its own. It's a necessary projection of US power in the region. So now what happens then is, of course, we know over time, this challenge escalates and it reaches its crescendo with Al-Aqsa flood 2 years ago, which Zionism has sought to crush with a genocide, and by crushing the resistance in the south of Lebanon. Now, however much they have engaged in widespread destruction and genocide, where it stands today is they have not eliminated the armed resistance in either Gaza or the south of Lebanon. And this is fundamental to what they're trying to restore in their deterrence capacity. So their inability to do so is also then converging with their inability to sink Iran through economic sanctions. And the same with Venezuela. Sanctions did not work, so they returned to an explicit military strategy to try to undermine this strategic depth. And this is why we must understand what's happening today. But they have been unable to do so. They launched the June War in the last summer, and they were unable to diminish the foundation of Iran's military production capabilities. In fact, what we've seen in the past 6 months is a remarkable replenishment of Iran's arsenal with support from China and Russia. We've seen a very rapid, and we've seen, on the other hand, imperialism's internal contradictions, Zionism's internal contradictions. They have not been able to replenish their interceptor missiles from that war. They have not been able to replenish the missiles they use targeting Ansar Allah, which is another branch of the axis that we could talk about. This is the reason they're targeting Iran today. They're trying to target Iran, to target Hezbollah, to target the Palestinians, to target Ansar Allah, because they cannot defeat the armed resistance. We have to have clarity on this. Now, I'm going to conclude my remarks with 2 points. We have seen something absolutely despicable from Western leaders this week. In response to 150 children being killed in a primary school, Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, the Australian leadership, all condemn Iran and support these strikes. They have nothing to say about the slaughter of children because they have lined up in support of US-led Western imperialism. And we must remember, in the history of Western imperialism, the West always reunifies when it comes to imperialism. We can go to the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, they reunify through the Opium Wars. They reunify after Alsace and Lorraine through the scramble for Africa. Western unity is bound through imperialism, but that's not the end of the story today, because there is an internal fracturing. The people of America, the people of Canada and of the West are increasingly rejecting Zionism, which is a rejection of imperialism, which is a rejection of endless war. This is what we confront today. This is why they're in such a rush. This is why Trump and Netanyahu know they have a narrow window today. They have a narrow window because internally they know Zionism's time is almost up internally. Its foundations are cracking. And externally, they know that Iran is replenishing its arsenal in its relations with China and Russia, and even on its own. It is a world historic feat what Iran is accomplishing. And what I will say is the significance of the title of the operation that Iran has given its response, Khatam al-Tufan. The end of, I wrote about this on Twitter, and then a lot of really people who are obsessed with kind of translation said I was wrong. I said it's the end of the flood. They said it translates to the end of the storm. In any case, Al-Aqsa flood was spoken about as Tufan Al-Aqsa, right? So now what they're signaling is this is a completion of Al-Aqsa flood. What they're saying is this is now existential for us as an axis. So this is very significant. Iran is explicitly linking this now to the broader regional struggle against genocide and the reassertion of sovereignty. And what we have seen in these first 2 days is remarkable. We've seen them in a total violation of any ethical or moral conduct, not only strike those students, but strike Khamenei and take out Khamenei, which is, beyond the pale. Can you imagine a Western leader being struck in that way, and the sort of gloating we've seen in the Western media? Now, they have done this, but at the same time, Iran has systematically taken out US radar systems over the past 2 days when it's hitting the Gulf countries, utilizing Chinese navigation systems that it has transitioned to. So we can see the long-run trajectory that imperialism is up against. So it is now, what I think Radhika is right. What is necessary then is to hasten that internal limit that it's trying to race against. So I know I'm well past time, I think, but I'll stop there and thank you for your patience. And I can address whatever else in the comments.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.